There is a belief that the Russian mob has penetrated the United States and is harvesting really high-end caviar by poaching sturgeon in U.S. rivers, taking it back to Russia and selling it as high-end Russian caviar. They write search warrants for all of the Russian mobsters they've identified across the United States, and it is literally every time zone in the U.S.
Sturgeon, the source of a valuable Russian delicacy, caviar.
A growing threat to our security, international organized crime.
Welcome to Socialite Crime Club. What kind of fishy tale are we telling socialites today?
I got a real whopper for you. We're going to dig in and peel back a few layers, see if we can find the real story.
I see what you did there.
But there's something stinky in Sacramento. Look at this beast of a whale. I got some fun facts we have to start with here.
It does look very prehistoric. This is a smaller sturgeon.
I thought we were just going to talk about fish. Little did I know until I started digging in. This dude's been around for over 100 million years. And for those of you that aren't good with timelines, he was here before the dinosaurs. He's still here.
Now, has he evolved in any other ways since that time that scientists have figured out, or is it the same structural features?
Obviously, he's evolved, but a lot of the same structural features. So let me explain what we're talking about. The white sturgeon, the American white sturgeon. Mm-hmm. They can get really, really big, but we'll get to that in a minute. They don't have scales. They have like a sandpapery skin, very similar to a shark.
Yes.
Their tail, their fin at the very end of their fish body,
yes.
the tail part,
yes, got it,
is very sharkish. Sharkish.
Yes, fin-like.
It looks like a shark fin.
It does. It has a pointy, like if they were at the surface of the water, it could potentially look like a shark in fresh water.
Right. And then you see those little spines down the back? They're very bony. Those aren't soft. They're really hard, almost like a bone.
Yeah, I could see that, yeah.
He's a bottom dweller, which means he just hangs out at the bottom and eats clams and shrimps and crabs. You see those little whiskers, almost like a catfish?
Looks catfish-like, yes.
Yeah, so he kind of goes around. One unique thing that they have evolved with, their taste buds are on the outside of their mouth, so they know what something tastes like before they put it in their mouth. I was thinking, I kind of wish I had that.
Similar to an octopus.
Yeah, you only eat what already tastes good to you, you don't have to put it in your mouth to figure it out.
That would be really nice. I just smell it and I know.
Yeah, these things can get up to 20 feet in length. They can be huge. They are monsters. The average is about 7 feet. The big ones, 1,300 pounds.
I've seen images of way back in the day when their populations were vast in number, and people were catching huge sturgeon. They appeared to be in the images up to 20 feet.
Yeah. The average today is 7 feet, about 400 pounds, which is still no joke. That's a big damn fish.
Yeah, big stinky fish.
Yeah, so they live in rivers primarily, but rivers that connect to the ocean. And the reason for that is they do require a certain amount of salinity. So they need some of the salt water, but not in the ocean, more of like those estuaries that dump into the ocean. What a lot of people don't realize, conversation we have to have up front.
Okay.
When I say caviar, it is amazing to me how many average normal people have no clue what fish caviar comes from.
Yes.
And caviar comes from sturgeon. Now, there are a number of different types of sturgeon.
It doesn't just come from sturgeon. I think historically, traditionally, it comes from sturgeon. However, over time, that has changed into it coming from potentially trout and salmon. But it's definitely not as renowned as sturgeon caviar.
The good stuff comes from sturgeon.
Right.
So they're desired for their eggs. Now, the problem is you don't wait, and I'm going to admit my ignorance here. Mm-hmm. I thought when you found a sturgeon, you just kind of watched it really good. When it laid its eggs, you just captured its eggs, just took the eggs, and then you went back and somehow made caviar.
You just swim into their nest.
It's not how it works.
Yeah, no.
You got to catch them early before they lay their eggs, and then you have to cut them open and take the eggs out.
And there are hundreds of thousands of eggs in one sturgeon.
Yes, they have these giant egg sac production thing that they do. But the problem is, to get the eggs, you got to kill the sturgeon. So just remember that as we go through this fishy tale. In typical American fashion, in the late 1800s, Americans realized the value of caviar and the plentiful nature of how many sturgeon were in the United States. and we overfished the shit out of them. Literally in 2 decades, we almost drove them to extinction. So there's a problem. Mainly the white sturgeon, that's what we're going to be talking about, at least the first half of this episode, is in California, around Sacramento, San Francisco areas.
I think I read something about they were so abundant that bar owners actually would serve caviar for free because of the salinity in of them to keep patrons drinking at the bar.
It would make them thirsty.
Yeah, it would make them thirsty, so they just stick around and keep drinking.
There were so many in like the Sacramento River that it was causing problems for fishermen who were fishing other types of fish that they couldn't put their nets in the water because they would catch so many sturgeon. And apparently, unless you smoke it, the sturgeon isn't that great of eating. But if you smoke it, it's supposed to be really good. So it was kind of a bad meat. And for many years, they would just kill the sturgeon, throw them back in the river to keep them out of their nets. But there were so many that it was actually interfering with fishing of other types of fish.
I see.
By 1917, California realized, hey, good job, guys. You pretty much killed off the species. We're going to stop fishing for them. So they outlawed sturgeon fishing.
I think before we continue to go on, our socialites need to understand there's a history of sturgeon that we need to get into before we can really make the case of what we're about to talk about for poached more impactful and quite significant of what's happening in that case.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, I just don't want people thinking that we're lingering on the history of sturgeon for too much.
Oh, no, it's important.
I know, that's what I was trying to explain.
Sturgeon are people too. Well, I guess they're not people.
They're not people.
Well, sturgeon are important too.
Hashtag sturgeon too.
Sturgeon
yes,
too.
sturgeon too.
In 1997, they had come back in groves, and now it is legal to fish for them again. You can fish in California 1 a day. Can only take 1 a day, 3 a year. So 1 a day, but you can only take a total of 3 in any calendar year.
I see.
One of the problems with sturgeon is you can't tell if they're male or female. And I'm going to recap why all this is important here in just a minute. But if you catch a sturgeon, you pull it out of the water, you can't look at it and be like, yep, that's a boy. Like, you don't know. There's other things you have to do.
Why do you do that accent for sturgeon specifically?
I just see somebody who's catching sturgeon trying to figure out what sex they are, being like, that's a boy sturgeon. You don't see that?
No.
Okay.
I would say you're profiling like somebody else told me I did recently, but okay.
Seasonal. They are a very seasonal fish because they only lay eggs once a year. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But there's a biopsy tool, and this thing is so crazy. I watched a video of how this works. It looks like a screwdriver. Mm-hmm. The part where the end of the screwdriver, what would you call it? The shaft of the screwdriver?
Sure.
It's kind of hollowed out, so it's U-shaped. And then at the very end, it has kind of a little ice cream scoop. Mm-hmm. You stick it in the sturgeon, and then you pull it out. And it's not just a little bit. It's like probably 6 inches or more. Mm-hmm. And if you stick it in their belly just right and pull it out, the eggs will get in that little U shape, and the ice cream scoop pulls all the eggs out. Oh. So when you catch a sturgeon, you can stab them with this screwdriver-looking thing. And if you pull eggs out, then you know it's a female. Oh. No eggs during a certain part of the year. All right, that's a male.
The sturgeon lives after this?
Yeah, it's pretty much a dinosaur. It takes a lot more than that to kill it.
I see.
Yeah.
Like a cockroach.
So talking about roe, which is the actual eggs, I got a picture here for you. And this is a sturgeon where the belly has been cut open. And you can see all that black, those little tiny BB looking things. Yes. That's the actual eggs. And yeah, they can have up to 200,000 per, what would you call that? Per
sturgeon? Per egg
per
sac?
Sturgeon, per cycle, per year.
Right. Oh, per year.
So when they stick that screwdriver and they pull it out, they'll pull some of these eggs out, and that's how they know by the color and the size and the shape that it's matured and ready for harvest. And then they actually have to kill the sturgeon, obviously, to cut it open like this.
It's interesting that you said the BB size and showing this, because I have read and understand that some sturgeon actually have eggs that are much bigger than a BB size, and those eggs are quite a bit more expensive.
So you're talking about the Russian beluga.
Yes. So
the beluga sturgeon out of Russia is the prized one. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit.
Okay.
Now let's get into the value. There's always got to be a value to this. Black market caviar. If I go catch a sturgeon, rip its belly open, find this giant sack of eggs, I can sell that on the black market for about $100 to $150 a pound.
Especially if somebody knows what they're looking for.
Correct.
In an egg.
Now, there are farms in California that raise white sturgeon specifically for the caviar. You can go onto the web and actually find where I can order this to our house right now. Typically, a couple ounces going to cost you just over $100. So if you think if I catch the whole fish, I can sell a pound for $100. But by the time you get it refined and down into caviar, it's about $100 an ounce. And to make some sense of this, I can get up to 20 pounds of what they call roe, R-O-E. That is the caviar itself. So I catch my sturgeon. I can harvest about 20 pounds off of a full-grown female sturgeon. I can sell that for about $100 a pound. So I make $2,000 for that fish.
Right.
But if I buy that for $2,000, convert it into caviar, which is actually a pretty easy process, I can sell it on the black market for about $16,000. I'm
understanding that there are certain processing procedures of caviar that can actually degrade it a little bit more, depending upon how much brine, it's not brine, but how salty it is that makes it overly briny, that actually reduces the quality of it. In addition to how long it's actually been out of the sturgeon, really affects the caviar, just like any other fish. But
it's kind of like wine. Like a really good winemaker can see what he has to work with and make a perfect wine.
Yeah, so the processing and preserving of it really impacts the quality and cost of the caviar.
So enough talk about the background. Basically what we're getting at here is sturgeon, specifically white sturgeon in the United States. That is the fish that actually produces the eggs that most people associate as to caviar in the United States.
Yes, because this is actually a very complicated thing.
It is. I had to watch so many videos for this, and it's expensive. Caviar is pricey.
Yes.
There is a black market that exists today that I can go catch 8 sturgeon a year. I'm making $100,000 if I do it right. Right.
Yeah.
So there is some actual real legitimate financial benefit to it.
Which makes me wonder, I just have to say, recently in our lives over the past 2 or 3 years, I do feel like we've had more opportunities to eat caviar, not necessarily by choice, but because it's been put in front of us, thankfully with a good glass of wine to wash most of it down. But I remember a caviar tasting that we were having, and we got, I think, 5 different types of caviar to eat. And by the time I got to the last one, I was really grossed out because it smelled like
fish.
Rancid, not even fish. It smelled worse than a bad fish. It smelled like rancid, sweaty socks. But they were having us taste it by putting it on our hand between our index finger and thumb. Yeah, and then you'd place it there and then actually lick it off, which from what I understand too, they do that so that you don't eat off of a metal spoon like silver, because it taints the taste of the caviar. So oftentimes they'll give you caviar with a mother of pearl spoon or a wooden spoon or something.
You're so refined.
I know, yeah. No, I've only come to understand this as of late.
And I hate fish. I cannot stand fish. I can't eat fish. A funny side story.
Yeah.
I want to like fish. I wish I could have a diet of fish. So I went on this crazy 3-day middle of nowhere hiking retreat where you have to hike into this area, Havasupai Falls in Arizona. It's a 10-mile hike in. You can only take what you can carry. And then it's a 10-mile hike out. And I was like, I'm going to make myself eat fish on this trip. And if I just force it, it's going to happen. So all I packed were those little to-go tuna packets with
you
relish.
Almost died,
I thought I was going to die. I almost starved to death. I couldn't eat it.
So I
hate fish.
Well,
but I kind of like caviar. Like caviar is good, especially with a good wine.
I like it, but I do have to be leery because every time it's put in front of me, it's very similar to that movie Office Space, where the guy goes to open the door and he doesn't know if he's going to get shocked or not. Right. Yeah, we had a friend tell us that story. That's how he feels when he opens his work computer. But it reminds me of that. I don't know when caviar is put in front of me if I'm going to have the shock value when it goes into my mouth. I think
my problem with eating caviar is I feel like a pretentious prick when I eat it.
You kind of look like it sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, we're going to go on. Clam poaching is also a thing, and rest assured, I'm not going to give our socialites the history of clam poaching, but apparently you just can't go to the beach and take a bunch of damn clams either.
Oh.
So the California Fish and Wildlife Conservation Team, the rangers, if you will, get a tip about some clam poaching that's going on.
I've never heard of clam poaching. This is interesting.
Andrew Chow, C-H-A-O, he's 31 years old. And this is going to be a tale, by the way. I've got to warn our viewers. There's going to be some butchery today.
Okay.
Mainly me butchering names. I can't pronounce anything that's about to happen here.
There's a man, he's of the age of 35. His name is spelled space, capital POU, space, SAECHAO.
All right, so I can't pronounce these names, but there's these two dudes, 31 and 35, and they are doing some clam poaching. Big deal. The investigators start checking out this clam poaching, and they're doing some stakeouts. The stakeouts lead to enough probable cause to get into some Facebook accounts. The Facebook allows enough probable cause to be developed to get into some GPS monitoring. And then they start actually looking at wire transactions, like who's sending money to who. And very quickly, they realize they have discovered an illegal black market poaching operation for caviar.
So there are illegal clam jams, it sounds like.
There's illegal clam jams. And those illegal clam jams have now developed into some sturgeon poaching for the caviar, which is seasonal, right? It doesn't happen all year because you have to wait for the sturgeon to actually have the eggs. So they start looking into this, and very quickly they find that Chow goes fishing quite a bit on the Sacramento River. I think it's towards the King's Landing, if anybody's familiar with Sacramento River. King's Landing is where he's going. And they start following Chow when he's fishing the Sacramento River. They're following him one night. He throws out his line. They watch him catch a fish. And the reason I took the time to explain the biopsy procedure is Chow has the ability to stick that little screwdriver in the fish really quick and say, oh, these eggs look perfect.
Were the investigators aware of this?
Of course they are. They're very smart. Very smart.
They usually are.
Yeah. Chow, seeing that this fish is impregnated with a big bunch of caviar, decides to take it home. So our wildlife officers decide to go ahead and stop Mr. Chow after he leaves because they see him struggling trying to put something very large in his trunk.
I think a lot of poachers, no matter what kind of animal they're poaching, try to put animals in their trunk.
Yeah, this is a 7-foot sturgeon that he has to cram into the trunk of his little Toyota or something here.
Yes.
Now, sturgeon are also really crazy about their ability to live out of water, how long they can live. So they watched him catch this fish. He hauls it back to the parking lot, crams it into the car, takes off down the road, gets a traffic stop. The wildlife officers find the sturgeon, put it in the back of a truck, drive it back to the river, throw it back in the river. It lives.
Oh my gosh.
It lived that whole time out of the water. It's a feel-good story.
It is. They're like an alligator.
Yeah. Well, they are very prehistoric. But now they're into Chow. They've got Chow figured out. He was doing this to harvest for the caviar.
Right.
So this is going to give them enough to get a search warrant onto Chow's property. They're going to find in his freezer 5 deer that he has poached. So he's a prolific poacher at this point.
Oh my gosh.
Abalones?
Abalones,
I think.
I'm not sure.
Crab. It's not
what is that? I don't even know what that is. I'm sorry.
It's clam.
Oh, it's a clam.
It's clam. Fancy clam.
I didn't know that. Okay.
A bunch of illegal guns to include some fully automatic weapons, a ghost gun that didn't have a serial number. Like, Chow's into some weird shit.
It sounds like it.
$57,000 in cash, some of it counterfeit. So, yeah, just crazy stuff. And 1,000 pounds of weed. Like, he likes
Is he
his weed.
making his own counterfeit currency? Do we know?
I don't know, but he's definitely causing some issues.
Okay.
Right? Now, this opens up the door to, well, what is he doing with this stuff? And there is a black market here. And we're going to talk about this quite a bit now that we're finally getting into the nuts and bolts of the episode here. There is a belief that the Russian mob has penetrated the United States and is harvesting really high-end caviar by poaching sturgeon in U.S. rivers, packaging the caviar from those sturgeon, taking it back to Russia and selling it as high-end Russian caviar.
What year was this all taking place?
This has been ongoing from about 2010 through cases as recent as a year or two ago.
Okay.
But
why Russians doing this?
Well, because it's a Russian caviar.
But it's not Russian caviar. It's American caviar.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. The problem here is that wildlife investigators link Chow to a Russian family in San Francisco who they suspect is buying the roe from people like Chow, harvesting it, creating the caviar, repackaging it, and selling it. This is the black market they're looking for.
Well, and during that time, Russia did put a smackdown on harvesting any type of beluga sturgeon because they were getting low in their populations.
Yeah, actually, it happened about a decade or two. It started a decade or two before this.
Right.
So when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of the regulations that were in place collapsed with it. So the overfishing of the beluga was out of control. And it almost drove it to extinction, which drove the price through the roof. So a lot of people couldn't afford it, and there just wasn't the quantity for the demand. So that's where people started falling back to the white sturgeon, which is also a very high-end caviar. It's a good caviar.
It's supposed to be very similar in taste to the beluga sturgeon.
Some Russian dudes, mainly the main guy, Igor, I can pronounce his name. They get into him very quickly through Chow. Chow is selling the roe to Igor. So they start watching Igor, and this is where we get involved, is they go up on what's called a trap and trace. For those of you at home that are curious, a trap and trace is a live feed of your cell phone connections that law enforcement can monitor in real time. There's no content. It's not a wiretap. I can't hear what you're saying. I can't see what you're texting. I can't figure out who you're browsing on or what websites you're browsing on. But I can see at this date and this time, you made a phone call to this phone number and you were connected to this cell tower type stuff. We actually built a system that law enforcement could use that would display this in real time. So when they went up on a wire, or in this case, a trap and trace, they would send the search warrant to Verizon. Verizon would provision that order, and then our system would display the information in real time. We were actually plugged in to Verizon. So I get this phone call, and they need some help on this case. I'm like, all right, yeah, well, what's the case? Caviar. I'm like, wait, what? So we are tracking the Russian mob for Blackmarket caviar.
Now, do we know that Igor and Lyudmila and these other two are part of the Russian mob, or are they just Russian?
No, we have no idea that they're part of the Russian mob.
Is this just a conspiracy?
Sounds so much sexier. If you think about it, it does sound sexy.
It does. Okay, but they're not.
I got some Russians in San Francisco that are buying caviar, or I've got some Russian mobsters in San Francisco trading caviar on the black market. What sounds
It's a
sexy?
better headline for sure.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they're going to start doing this trap and trace, tracking the phones. They're going to put GPS on the vehicles, and eventually they're going to physically watch Igor buy a bucket of roe. They then follow him back to the house where he and the other three here convert that roe into actual caviar, package it, and try to sell it.
Oh
and they're going to get into PayPal, which is one of the ways that they're denoting receiving the money for the caviar. And you know how they know which PayPal accounts are paying for caviar opposed to something else?
They claim it for a tax credit?
No, they put a fish or a whale emoji for each caviar sale. And their PayPal, like sales thing, you would see money going back and forth, but any chunk of money that was denoted by a fish or a whale emoji was caviar.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So I take it they weren't paying taxes on it, on their profits?
Well, here's where I kind of went like, hang on. They get all this information. They look at the PayPal. It's a couple $100.
Oh.
Yeah, it's pretty low level.
Sure.
So they end up scooping everybody up, and they prosecute them all to the fullest extent of the California law.
Mm-hmm.
They all get a little bit of probation.
It seems like that's all there was really going on, or some type of really low-level fine.
Well, and let's be honest, when we think about people fishing, every time you take a fish, it's hard to say poaching. Like, I don't know, for some reason, when you shoot a giant bull elk and you don't have a permit, you don't have a license, I really feel like, okay, that is truly a crime.
More people know about it.
Yeah, when you throw a line into the river and you catch a fish, I don't know, for some reason, it just doesn't feel the same to me.
It's hard to say what's really going to come out of the water when you throw a line in the water.
Yeah, well, and fishing is fishing. Like, you don't need, it's not like an elk hunt where only certain people get to do it at a certain time of year. Anybody can buy a fishing license.
Right, but I suppose when you start digging around in the fish with a probe, it becomes a little bit more molestive in nature.
I was just really excited to be involved in the case that involved the Russian mob.
And then you were severely disappointed.
I was so sad. I was like, this sucks. But I didn't give up. I'm going to keep going here. Wait, we have some other wildlife people that we have worked with in the past who have done the same thing, but this time it was the Russian mob, allegedly. So let's talk about paddlefish for a minute.
Okay.
Paddlefish are a hideous, ugly, nasty fish.
They are quite ugly. They almost look similar to a sturgeon, a different species.
But they are freshwater only, and they are found in Missouri, in the Ozarks. Yep, there's paddlefish.
Oh, God. Stop.
So the paddlefish also produce roe, very similar to sturgeon, but not the quality. It tastes kind of earthy.
Yeah, and from what I understand, the eggs are actually smaller than a baby.
Yeah.
Really tiny.
Desperate times call for desperate measures, though. The problem that the Russian mobsters were facing at this time is the collapse of the Soviet Union. You couldn't get the good beluga. They take anything they can get because at the end of the day, if they repackage it and it looks very similar, by the time they distribute it and it gets to somebody's home and they open it.
It smells fishy.
Yeah, but they've already paid for it, right? Like, how are they going to track it back? And then what do? File a complaint with the Russian mob?
Right. Well, and the good ones don't even smell fishy. So how do these people not realize they're not getting good caviar?
Missouri has a problem where it appears Russians in droves are going to Warsaw, Missouri every year around the right time to harvest paddlefish for caviar. And they're taking note that more fish are being captured or taken than should be. And oh my God, this is the Russian mob penetrating the middle of the Americas, right? Like we have the Russian mob active in the Ozarks.
This is a crisis.
It is a crisis. Can't have these damn Russians running around the Ozarks. So the Missouri Department of Conservation comes up with Operation Roadhouse.
Okay.
I'm going to pay some props here. And he's going to remain nameless because I'm going to keep him in kind of an undercover role. There is a wildlife officer with the Missouri Department of Conservation who's known worldwide about his sneaky tactics. His undercover operations are legendary. He comes up with the craziest ideas, and Missouri's like, sounds good to us, do it.
Okay.
Operation Roadhouse, the state of Missouri is going to take over a kind of a bait and tackle shop with a dock. It's going to be state ran by undercover officers who are going to sell the permits and licenses to the Russian mob to harvest the paddlefish so that they can penetrate the organization and get to know these guys. So they take a bunch of wildlife officers, they put them as dock workers and bait and tackle workers to befriend these Russian mobsters.
And all their girlfriends work at Lickety Splits.
Probably so. Thursday is half off night. But yes.
Okay.
And the problem is, what do the Russians like to do? What does everybody immediately assume the Russians do? They drink.
Vodka
And anything else. So
potato vodka.
Operation Roadhouse basically turns into how drunk can we get with the Russians trying to build a case?
Do they eat caviar with vodka?
Oh, they love the caviar. This is the whole thing. This is why it's Russian.
But with vodka specifically?
I don't know that it's vodka. You're getting too hung up on the type of alcohol.
When I think of Russians, I think...
Not when you're in the Ozarks. The Ozark Russians
finer
drink
drinks
beer.
that they're known for.
The Ozark Russians drink beer. So in 2013...
Pabst Blue Ribbon.
We had... Yeah, I'm sure it's Pabst. In 2013, basically you had all these wildlife officers hanging out with all these Russians who they thought were the mobsters doing whatever they could in undercover role to get in to these organizations. And it basically involved a bunch of drunk Russian fishermen hanging out with a bunch of drunk wildlife officers, shooting the shit and becoming really good friends.
Oh dear. Okay. What became of this?
They develop who they think might be the main target. Fedor Penyanyuk.
Pekunyak?
Penyanyuk, yeah.
I think it's Pekunyak.
Fedor.
Pekunyak.
And Fedor was actually really prolific in this area. He showed up every year. He would take more than his fair share of paddlefish. It was clear he was there to get the eggs for the caviar. He even talked about wanting to run a caviar empire.
And how long did this undercover op take place?
So every season, for like 2 seasons, they would run it. Because remember, it's only a short period of time. So Fedor, though, was so prolific in his claims of creating this caviar underground that they figured, this is our guy. He is the main guy. They write search warrants for all of the Russian mobsters they've identified across the United States.
Okay.
And it is literally every time zone in the U.S. So they're going to serve search warrants at all these people's houses to do the big roundup and make all the connections of the Russians
across America, your house is getting searched.
Mobsters.
Oh my gosh.
So a handful of them went to Fedor's house just outside of Chicago. And this gets actually pretty comical. They knock on the door. Fedor answers. And he immediately recognizes them as the dock workers he drank a lot of beers with last season.
He's like, come on in.
He says, hey guys, what's up? What can I do you for? You want to get a beer?
I've got some caviar to go with it.
Yeah, and they're like, Fedor, you're in a lot of trouble. We know that you have been harvesting these paddlefish for the caviar. It's illegal. We're here to arrest you, buddy, and we got to search your house. And Fedor's like, okay, I don't, it's not that big of a deal. Do you guys want to get a beer when you're done? He actually asked, and they're like, Fedora, you're not taking this serious. You're going to jail. And he's like, yeah, but it's not that big of a deal. When I get out, if you guys want to grab a beer, I'm cool.
That should have been a red flag of maybe we've got something wrong here.
Something's wrong.
Yes.
They search Fedora's house. They do find a little bit of caviar, but it's all personal consumption style.
Right.
But now they're too far in to quit. So they've got to book him. So they're driving him to the jail. And he's still like, hey guys, how long? Like, I just have to see the judge, right? When I'm done with the judge, seriously, let's go get a beer. I miss you guys.
Oh, poor Fedora.
And they're like, no, Fedora, you're in trouble. You're part of the Russian mob. And he's like, no, man, I just want to drink a beer and fish.
I just want to be American.
Yes. So they book Fedora. The judge sees Fedora, and they're like, even the judge is, yeah, no.
Get out of my courtroom.
Get out of my courtroom. Stop wasting my time. And then even then, Fedora's like, hey, you guys want to get a beer or what?
Oh my gosh. This is terribly heartbreaking.
Where I'm going with this is it was interesting. And I kind of thought when we first got into doing this episode, because I've heard bits and pieces, I know that our software, some of our training, we did a lot of stuff with wildlife guys, and I kept hearing all these rumors about, oh no, we're penetrating the Russian mob.
Okay.
To date, there has been no connections to the Russian mob. What they found is a lot of these people did have Russian roots. In Russia, hospitality is actually a really big deal. When you have people into your home, when you have friends and family, you put out your best stuff. This isn't when you hide your good alcohol. You would know something about this.
No, I don't do that. No, only a certain type. I still bring out good stuff.
In Russia, it's really kind of your time to shine. Well, granted, there was a huge gap in the market because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You couldn't get the good beluga caviar. In fact, it was hard to get good caviar anywhere. So what a lot of Russian immigrants in the United States did is they started figuring out how to harvest sturgeon and paddlefish for their own private use. So they would create this caviar, package it up, keep it for themselves, and then when they had friends and family, it was kind of their bragging rights of, hey, we have our own homemade caviar that's out of this world.
Interesting.
Very quickly, Operation Roadhouse, which at this time, remember, the state of Missouri bought the dock, the bait shop, all of the time and effort. Like for 2 years, for 2 different seasons, they were incredibly invested into this operation to expose the Russian mafia, when at the end of the day, all they did is find a bunch of drunk Russian fishermen who still wanted to go get a beer with them.
That is funny.
This craze, if you will, for caviar extends beyond just Russian drunk fishermen. You found where there was actually some government officials.
Yeah, there was a biologist who actually got into this same thing working
California, right?
I
think it was California, state of California.
I don't remember for sure, but I read the article briefly, and he was working with Department of Natural Resource agents, and they were actually packaging caviar for family and friends under the guise of doing research on sturgeon.
So the wildlife conservation officers would bring him sturgeon into his lab for him to study for different reasons, and kind of behind closed doors, he's harvesting the caviar. I believe
that was it. But he was working with them, so everybody was getting a cut of it. So they were sending it off to a processing center. The processing center would get a cut of it to take home some caviar, and then the biologist would send the caviar off to his family and friends, and then also the DNR agents were doing this as well. So everybody was taking a cut of this, but I also feel like I don't know if the sturgeon at this time were actually truly endangered and how widespread that was known. I just don't think that it would have been that prolific in the space if it had been as well known and as it was.
Yeah, and the populations have really come back pretty well.
Yeah.
And I agree, there still needs to be some conservation there. We don't want to drive them to extinction. But I also think we've got to keep this in perspective. Just because somebody's harvesting some fish eggs because they think they taste yummy doesn't make them a Russian mobster.
Right.
So, yeah. And I think to close out this episode, one of the reasons after figuring all this out, I'm like, okay, do we really want to cover this one? Is I want to get into conspiracies just a little bit.
Okay.
Everybody loves to run with a conspiracy. When you look at the true crime space on YouTube or any other channel right now, everybody loves to run with these giant conspiracies. I don't think that they factor in how hard it is to pull off a conspiracy. And when you think about how hard it is, all of the different layers of people you have to bring in, and they all have to get the stories the same, right, to make it truly work. But then you also look at the levels of incompetence in all of those layers of people. You don't get both ways. Either law enforcement in general or some of these organizations that typically people want to make out into some type of law enforcement function, either they're incompetent or they're conspiracists. You don't get both.
Right.
You don't pull off an incompetent conspiracy because it's really, really hard to do.
Typically it's incompetence, but I'm not saying there aren't conspiracies out there for sure.
But not nearly to the level that most people claim.
Not nearly to the level of what's put out on YouTube.
Can we go ahead and debunk, if this was a Mythbusters episode, Can we go ahead and say we have found no evidence of the Russian mob penetrating the United States sturgeon caviar market?
I'll take you for your word on that. I don't know. I haven't been that involved in it. I barely know caviar when it's put in front of me, much less getting into the weeds.
We can go ahead and at least say that it's not a major concern in 2024.
Right. Yeah, I'm not seeing it in the headlines, but I would agree with you that conspiracy theories out there are a little rampant, and not just in the true crime space on YouTube, but also
everywhere.
All over the true crime space. It's actually really concerning for me.
Yeah. All right. So next week,
join us for A Cup of Innocence.
Oh, it's a good one.
Have a great week, socialites.
She was at Graham Central Station. She's leaving. The night's over. They're closing it down. She's walking to her car by herself in the parking lot. And as she goes to get into her car, somebody comes up behind her, a male, puts a knife to her throat, forces her into the car, into the driver's seat, and he's sitting directly behind her.